Good
Hey,
morning
everybody.
or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. I am Auverin Morrow, Esports Brand Manager at Hi-Rez Studios.
And I'm Alex Cantatore, the VP of Brand at Hi-Rez Studios. I oversee all branding efforts for all of our games and also our esports team. Came into this as a big esports fan and very excited to be working with the team now.
Yeah, we're super glad to have him. So today we're actually going to be talking a little bit about SMITE Esports and our ecosystem, and kind of how we came back from several years of significant decline in community engagement and other areas of our operations.
Yep.
So we'll just go ahead and get right into it, I think.
Yeah. And just kind of real quick before we get started, if you've never played Smite or heard of Smite, so Smite is a third-person action MOBA set in the battleground of the gods. So you play a god from mythology like Thor or Zeus or Guan Yu from Chinese mythology, and then you engage in a 5v5 MOBA like a League of Legends or a Dota. The big difference is that it's from a third-person action perspective right behind the character, and you have to actually aim all your screenshots. You have to move around the map using WASD. And it's a very engaging play experience. It's different from the other MOBAs on the market. It also is available on all the consoles, which is an area of strength for us. We are the #1 MOBA on console. So yeah, just kind of quick overview as to what Smite is as a product before we jump into what SMITE Pro League is. So you have a little bit of context as to what we're talking about.
Beautiful. All right. So I'm going to start sort of at one of the lowest points in our competitive life cycle. Smite has had a competitive ecosystem for 8 seasons now. We started with a launch tournament way back in the day when we were in our very early stages of development, and since then, year over year, we have done various iterations of our competitive scene, including a top-level pro league, and then filtering down into semi-pro leagues, amateur leagues, and even some global leagues at certain points in our life cycle. But we have seen a lot of ups and downs in that time. I don't think any esport gets this far into its life cycle without seeing something like that. But for us, as we hit the middle of our life cycle, seasons 4, 5, and even into season 6, we started to see a really significant decline in fan engagement, in viewership, and in other parts of our operations. So season 5, by pretty much all metrics, was our worst year ever. And this was the first year that I actually took over and started my career at Hi-Rez as a community manager. So I was dropped into basically the middle of one of our worst seasons ever. So we were looking at a situation where our viewership was really low, social engagement was at an all-time low. Resources were spread pretty thin across a number of different leagues. We had, over 8 sub-leagues operating at the time, with a very small staff. And we were in a situation where community sentiment was pretty negative. We had just announced that we were moving to Mixer, and even though that was an opportunity that we were super excited about, we've always been willing to take risks, and we wanted to be sort of an early adopter in the Mixer ecosystem. We saw a lot of opportunity, but our fans didn't necessarily see it that way. So community sentiment around that turned very negative very quickly. And on top of that, we were seeing a lot of organization turnover with our partner organizations year over year, which was making our competitive ecosystem a little bit more unstable than we really would have liked. And sort of all of that combined with poor communication on our side meant that there was really a lack of trust and transparency between our studio and our community. So a lot of the choices that we made, they didn't understand why we were making them, and sentiment would get worse, and then the cycle would just kind of continue.
Yeah. So Hi-Rez has one of its core values as scientific. And scientific kind of means data-driven, but more than that, it means you should conduct experiments and use the results of those experiments to guide what you do. So one of the first kind of experiments and questions we really had to ask ourselves at this time was, is the SPL something that's just past its prime? Is the SMITE community not one that needs or watches esports anymore? this may seem like an obvious, well, it's a MOBA, of course it needs an esport. But Smite is an interesting game because it has a lot of different game modes that are popular with a lot of different skill levels and a lot of different core levels of gamers. So a very large percentage of our player base just plays a mode that we call Arena, which is a basically team deathmatch mode. The game is really fun to play in Arena. I highly recommend it to anybody that doesn't want to try and learn a MOBA but wants to get the feel of that. And a lot of people play the game just for that reason with their friends. We do also have a very large percentage of our players who are hardcore. Conquest is our main MOBA mode. Hardcore Conquest players. But we really wanted to ask ourselves the question, has our player base shifted? Is this something that's really still worth doing? So we partnered with Emory University, which, if you aren't familiar, Emory University is one of the most notable universities in the South, at least, and definitely one of the biggest universities here in Atlanta. They have a major medical program, and they also just do a lot of great, scientific work all around. But we partnered with some researchers at Emory University here, and they did a very, very interesting study that looked at players before and after they engaged with SPL. And we have really deep hooks set up with Twitch, so we know when you're watching Twitch so that we can give you drops and whatnot. So we can tell very granularly, okay, this person played Smite for a year and never watched SMITE Pro League, and then they started watching, and what happened after that. And what we saw was actually kind of surprising to us. The numbers were even more significant than we thought they would be. We kind of thought in our heads, oh yeah, people watch SPL and maybe it makes them into a more hardcore player of Smite. It makes them understand the game better. But this was all kind of these ethereal thoughts that we didn't have a lot of numbers behind, and it's hard to believe in that if you don't have some numbers. So through this study, what they discovered in this blind test of people who hadn't and then did, we saw that people that started watching SMITE Pro League played 33% more, which is incredibly substantial. They are 33% more sessions, 44% more minutes. So both they played more sessions and their sessions were longer. They won 20% more, which MOBAs are balanced where you win and you lose 50% of the time. To win 20% more is an astonishing level of skill improvement just by watching pros and understanding how to play the game better. Because Smite is a very difficult game to play from a mechanical perspective, because you do have to do WASD and aim every shot. And there's still all the technical parts of a MOBA where you need to know what items to build and where you should be on the map at a given time. So just by learning through watching SPL, they had 20% more wins and 20% more kills than non-viewers, which is, again, just a staggering fact. When these numbers first came in, I thought that they must have done the study wrong, and they, kind of just divided people into two buckets of people that had been watching for years and people that had never watched. And it's like, no, this was very rigorous. This is real numbers. And then from a cold-hearted capitalist perspective, people that started watching SMITE Pro League were twice as likely to make a purchase than people that didn't watch esports. So I think there's always one of these questions in the world of esports. Is esports just a money pit? There's not a lot of, other than bringing sponsors into the ecosystem, right? It is a marketing expense. It's kind of how we've always viewed it. And a lot of money goes into making esports happen. We spend millions of dollars a year on it. And, Smite is not as big as League of Legends or Dota or CSGO or a lot of the big esports games, right? We actually made foam fingers that are number 3 because, we kind of lead into the, we're the plucky underdogs and we try and punch above our weights and, try a little bit harder. But, to support an ecosystem the size of SMITE Pro League for a game the size of Smite is a big investment. And this data really showed us that this investment is worth it because based on all of our other data, no other single thing that we're doing is better at converting these casual people who are playing Arena into the conquest players who are playing more and more hours a week and really making Smite a core hobby part of their life. Another one of Hi-Rez's favorite tenets is do less better. If you ever meet our CEO, Stu Chisholm, he will probably say "do less better" at one point during your conversation. Maybe not so much anymore, but a couple years ago it was his favorite catchphrase. So we knew that we couldn't keep doing, even though we wanted to keep SPL going, we couldn't keep doing it the way that it was because we were running too many leagues. We were spreading ourselves too thin. And though we were doing a lot, and like I said, we always have this inclination to Smite to try and punch above our weight and do everything that we see other people doing. We needed to narrow our focus a little bit and do the few things that really mattered the most as well as we could possibly do them. And focus a little bit on how much money we were putting into it as well. I'm going to talk through the first half of the slide. The league structure and resource management needed an overhaul for the league to become more sustainable. As I mentioned earlier, Smite is very popular on console. So to support our console players, we were running the SMITE Pro League on PC. We were running the SMITE Console League, which had two separate leagues within it for Xbox players and PS4 players because they were separate ecosystems at the time. We were running a minor league. We were running regional sub-minor leagues in various regions around the world. And it just became too much. So we decided, you know what, we need to focus on just running a incredibly strong SMITE Pro League that takes advantage of crossplay. So you can play on controller, you can play on keyboard and mouse. We actually implemented keyboard and mouse support on all the consoles as well. So if somebody wanted to use keyboard and mouse on their PS4, they could plug it in and play that way, right? It's we didn't want hardware to be a barrier to people not being able to play keyboard and mouse if that's what they chose to do. So we really leaned into this idea of cross-play. Doesn't matter what you're on, everybody's playing together. We also focused our resources in terms of where our leagues were on our two strongest regions, which are North America and Europe for our game. So we made those our premier regions, and we let people who are outside of those regions play in North American and Smite leagues, but we don't run official Smite highest level competitive leagues in any areas other than North America and Europe now, just because it didn't make sense when we looked at it from a numbers perspective. So we do still run community tournaments in those areas. We do still have a lot of players representing Oceania and South America in particular in our pro league, but it just didn't make financial sense to run separate leagues for them anymore. So there's still a path to pro where people can play through an open series that anybody can play in, the Challenger circuit, which is kind of like a minor league, and then the pro league. And then that's where we are. We also moved all the pro players here to Atlanta to do a LAN league, again, making the SPL better viewing experience with players here on LAN, and take full advantage of tax incentives that we get here. So the state of Georgia has very generous tax incentives for all entertainment products. That's why all the Marvel movies were shot here for many years and many other things. So we really wanted to make sure we took advantage of that. And then one of the biggest changes we made, which we're going to talk more about later, we made the very tough decision to remove all partner organizations from our competitive ecosystem and instead developed 8 new team brands, which are owned and operated by Hi-Rez, running all of our teams in-house.
So kind of on top of our structural and resource management changes, we also knew that we had to do something about the community sentiment and how we communicated with our fan base. That was probably one of our weakest areas of operations, because we knew internally why we were making these choices, but filtering that through to the community in a way that they will understand and accept is very difficult. I mean, that's what all of marketing is really about, is making sure that your fan base understands, what you're doing and why you're doing it. So I'll talk a little bit more later about how we made this successful, because it is kind of a risky thing to do. But we adopted a policy of a radical transparency that sort of centered our community in our decision-making process. Every decision we made, we said, okay, how is this going to impact the community? What is the community going to think of this? And in some cases, we even went to our community and said, hey, we're kind of stuck between two options here. What would you folks prefer to see? And including them in that process, making them part of the collaborative thinking that we were doing around some of these decisions, made them feel like we trusted them, and it made them trust us a little bit more, even when they didn't necessarily understand why we were making certain decisions. So on top of that, we also sort of drastically changed what our brand voice looked like on social media and even on some of our broadcasts. We had moved very far in a direction of trying to be a serious esport. But like Alex mentioned, we're the plucky underdogs. We like to punch up, and we're a little bit weird. That's just how it is. We have a skin in the game that's literally a flying piece of toast. So we figured we had to lean into that a little bit more. So we sort of drastically changed how we approach social media. It's very meme heavy now. If you go look at our Twitter timeline, it's weird in there. It's great. So we sort of changed that, and we also used that to change how we approach sponsor marketing. So for sponsors like Alienware, Maxonomic, we have done some admittedly very strange commercials that very much stick in the community's mind. And for Alienware, we even ended up doing a video where we close it out, and one of the players just completely unprompted says, "And you're telling me an alien wore this?" And that spread like wildfire. It gets chanted in chat every time the video gets played, and you cannot plan sponsor awareness that good. So sort of leaning into that weirdness and leaning into what made us different, and using that as a core part of our brand voice, really helped us reestablish a unique presence in the space and helped us reconnect with fans and make them feel like, okay, this is a brand that I recognize, this is the game that I recognize and love, and make sure that our esport really matched that. And then kind of our last thing, this was just a big sentiment win. We did move back to Twitch after 2 seasons of Mixer exclusivity. We were able to do so much being with Mixer for those 2 years, that we were able to offer things like POV streaming. We were basically the first game, maybe the only game, to offer drops on Mixer. We learned a lot in that time. And so we did move back to Twitch for season 7, which was a huge sentiment win for us. And those 3 things kind of sort of encapsulated these massive changes that we made for our community and started to win back a lot of the sentiment that we had lost in the middle parts of our life cycle.
Cool. So as I mentioned, we made the tough decision to cut out all of the external organizations that were running teams in our league. And, we've had a lot of, again, going back to the experimentative, the scientific core value of Hi-Rez, we've run leagues like the Paladins Premier League that had, 8 of the biggest team orgs in the industry in them. And we thought we'd reached a point in SMITE where it was worth running an experiment where, what if we just own and run all of the organizations ourselves? I think for us, we really wanted to have, there were a lot of reasons that led to it. One of the main reasons from a player perspective, we wanted to make sure that our players were incredibly happy and felt super well treated. In the season previous to the one where we implemented this, there was a lot of concern about player salaries, and some allegations, which I don't necessarily believe are true, but the players felt like the outside organizations were working together to keep salaries artificially lower than they should have been. Again, I don't necessarily believe that was the case. We investigated it and didn't find it to be the case, but players were just kind of unhappy with the situation. And we know that esports is a player-driven endeavor like the NBA more than it is a team-driven endeavor like the NFL. So we wanted to make sure our faces, our players, were happy, and we wanted to give them more agency over the entire thing. We want to make sure that they were always treated well. We've had issues where we pay an organization and they're very slow in getting that payment passed down to the players. We've run into situations where we players do not necessarily benefit as they should from merchandise sales that they are generating for an organization. And if they bring sponsors to the organization, maybe they don't get the level of revenue that they did. So we really wanted to be able to plan an organization or a SMITE Pro League that is 100% player focused. And in this new model, players receive 100% of the revenue they generate. They are responsible for the rosters themselves. We don't tell them what their rosters are. It's majority team vote. If 3/5 of the team say they want this player out and replaced with this other player, cool, it's fine. It's basically letting the players run the league and feel like they are in control. And they're all incredibly happy with how it's turned out and have put more and more time into it. The big win from a viewer perspective is you can now root for a team year over year. And it's not like, okay, well, we have Esports Org X part of the scene this year, and then they sell their stake to another team next year, and the name changes and the roster changes, and you don't know who these people are anymore. It now is if you're an Olympus Bolts fan, you can follow the Olympus Bolts every year and know that it's going to have that same core group of players. So it's been really exciting, both from a player perspective, giving them a lot more agency, and from a viewer perspective, helping them follow the league a lot better.
So this was obviously a really big, really radical change, especially to make it 7 seasons in. So this is a change that we announced at the end of season 7, which we wrapped up last year. And this season 8 has been our first season using all of these new team brands. And you can see the brands that we created over here on the right. So one of our biggest community concerns around this change, they said, well, aren't you going to be severely limiting how much visibility you get, how many new fans that you acquire, and how much social media engagement that you get by not having these orgs involved? And from the data that I was able to pull from the social activity around our SPL teams from some of these partner organizations, we had 2 or 3 orgs who were very, very engaged with what we were doing, who were constantly posting about SMITE, constantly memeing about matches, and who were really, really beloved organizations. But the rest of them weren't really engaging fans that way. And we just felt like if we bring all of this in-house and we give every single team the love and social presence and content strategy that it deserves, we really will see a bigger return than what we saw with orgs. Because realistically, for a game like SMITE, it's very, very rare that somebody comes in as a fan of the org and then becomes a fan of SMITE. SMITE has a very hyper-dedicated player base. And if you like SMITE, you like SMITE. And if you've never heard of SMITE, it's very rare that you're going to be a fan of, some partner organization and then you become a fan of SMITE later on. So in our first year, and we haven't even gotten to our biggest marketing beat of the year, which is the SMITE World Championship in January. But just for the regular season, the 8 team accounts that we created Twitter accounts for all of these teams. They all have slightly different brand voices that we engineered. And we have an excellent social media team that runs these accounts, and they talk to each other. They kind of beef it out with each other like partner orgs do on Twitter. So we have been able to generate over 17.1 million Twitter impressions from these 8 accounts, 1.3 million Twitter engagements, over 1.1 million views on YouTube from team-based content. And so far, as of October, they have generated $185,000 in merchandise and cosmetic sales. And all of that money goes directly back to the teams. So every player on those teams is benefiting from the fact that they've engaged with these brands this way. And one of the reasons this was so successful is because, like Alex mentioned, this is a player-driven league. People show up for the player personalities. People show up for players like Fine OK. People show up for players like Polar Bear Mike. And because we included players in this process and made some of their revenue streams directly dependent on how authentically they engage with these brands and how much they push them, it really motivated players to get a lot more involved. And in some cases, I'll be honest, they kind of showed us up when it came to marketing. For one of my favorite examples is the Jade Dragons brand. When we first announced their merch line, it very heavily featured this very like jammy, like raspberry color red that you can see in their logo here. And they took it and ran with it. They called it Jazzberry Jam. They called themselves the Jazzberry Jammers. And if you get beaten by the Jade Dragons, you just got jammed. Sorry. And one of their players, Polar Bear Mike, he put out a single video promoting their merch that did better than our entire merch launch promo for that team combined. He blew us out of the water. And that team is one of our top selling teams because those players really took it, ran with it, engaged with it, and then started to engage their communities. And they're motivated to do that because they directly benefit from it. And it's been really cool to see how they've taken that in stride.
Yeah, the one other kind of quick thing I would just add on that is that some of the team Twitter accounts in a year now have grown to be larger than some of the org Twitter accounts that were previously a part of the SPL. So we just feel very positive with how that whole thing has gone. It was a big risk, but it's turned out very well.
Yeah, it has really, really paid off. I think we have about 5 minutes left, so I will get through this one really quickly. So like I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we did to make sure that this worked was we adopted a policy of radical transparency. Esports communities, because the esports space can be kind of volatile, esports communities tend to be like hyper vigilant to change. They're a little bit finicky, and it's very easy to throw them into a panic. Because the esports community tends to be so tightly knit, they kind of act like a hive mind sometimes. And if a couple of people start to panic, pretty soon everybody's panicking. And year over year, when we were making changes this bold and different, we really needed to make sure that they understood exactly what we were doing at every turn, why we were doing it, and what we genuinely thought the results would be. So kind of the way that we did this, we started creating in-depth community reports around every major league decision. If something went well, we wrote a report about it. If something went wrong, we wrote a report about it. We would also do things after we announced major changes. We would host roundtable podcasts. We would host AMAs to give fans an opportunity to really ask us a lot of questions, even the hard questions. And we would answer them as candidly as we possibly could. We also made rule sets and all of our league policies publicly available to fans. Those are posted directly on our website for anybody who is interested in them. And then we made sure that we also proactively and very candidly were responding to people on social media, be that Reddit, Twitter, wherever else. And for a studio, for any brand, really, that level of transparency can be really scary and it can be really risky. But for us, it proved absolutely invaluable to making sure that our fans really trusted us and would stick with us as we went through some transitional years. And what we were most surprised by was that if you're honest with your fans, even if they don't like the answer or even if they don't necessarily agree, they'll be like, okay, well, I trust you to do it. And one excellent example of this, I think, is last year we had to do our SMITE World Championship from home because of what was going on with COVID at the time. And we had one team who their visas were expiring the day after Worlds wrapped up, which means that they had to be on flights that night to make sure that they were back in their home countries so that they would be able to come back and get visas again next year. But to make that happen, we had to pre-record our finals and run our finals off demos. And because it was a very long set, it was a best of 5 game. They were doing interviews in the daylight. We had to pre-record our interviews, pre-record our trophy ceremony, and we finished when it was dark out, but it was daylight during all of those pre-recorded videos. So people were like, Hi-Rez, what's going on? Like, what's up? And we just went out there. I went out there and told them, I was like, hey guys, this is the situation. We had a visa problem. We had to pre-record things. It was our only option unless you don't want to see these players next year. And they immediately calmed down and said, okay, hey, you know what? We trust you. Thanks for doing that. Thanks for making sure they can come back, and completely smoothed the whole thing right over. And that kind of transparency has really been so key to making sure that our community came along with us as we made all of these pretty radical changes. So kind of the way that all of this has turned out, we have seen a strong resurgence in our community, and this is in every metric that we can possibly measure. We took big risks. Now we're reaping really big rewards. And as of this year, the SPL is more competitive and more profitable than it's been at pretty much any other point in its life cycle. We've seen our viewership surge to levels that we haven't seen since pretty much the earliest season of Smite. And our watch hours have actually been at a higher level than they've ever been, which means we have more people watching for longer, which points to long-term retention and long-term engagement. We also have a lot more agency over our brands and our sub-brands, so we can plan really long-term projects and in-game integrations that are built around these brand identities, and it gives our scene a sense of stability that it didn't necessarily have before. And our fans now have the sense, okay, they're really invested in these brands, they're really invested in the scene, and the SMITE Pro League is here to stay. And so now they worry a little bit less. They could sit back, they can enjoy the competition. And our community and social engagement on the SMITE Pro brand and our team brand accounts are pretty much at an all-time high. You can see this chart over here on the left. Those are our total engagements for Worlds last year, and it is absolutely through the roof. We have never seen anything like it.
Yeah, and we've seen similar results on the game side, amplified by what we've done on esports, right? Smite hit its all-time peak concurrent player count on Steam in January of this year, immediately following the Smite World Championship. So we really believe that esports combined with excellence in live service operations can really drive a game to continued growth, even a decade after it launches.
All right, well, that is all for us. I appreciate everyone's time and attention, and hopefully you will tune into the SPL. We are starting our Road to Worlds December 14th, and we have SWC happening January 6th.
Thank you so much for your time, everybody.